Hello everyone and welcome to another Coffee with Thorben live stream. I hope you grabbed a cup of coffee or tea or whatever you prefer and that you're doing fine. I also saw some of you here in the chat, so let me quickly say hi. So, how are you? I hope you're doing well and that the whole Corona situation right now doesn't affect you too much. Here in Germany, we are still, well, we should still stay at home. Schools are, some of them are opening, others will follow in a few weeks, and it seems like the whole restrictions will be reduced a little bit in the next few weeks. So let's hope that we don't get a lot of additional infections after that, but at least here the situation seems to be not too bad. I hope it's the same for you. So yeah, I'm taking a look at the chat right now. Hi Krunal, hi Mr. Eldernak and Kakani. I'm good, Krunal, thanks for asking. Okay, yeah, maybe let's just start with the first question before we dive into the main topic for today's live stream. I found an interesting question on Stack Overflow with a bounty of 250 points, and well, I would like to give it a shot and see if we can solve that thing. So Mir asks, criteria builder and string, how does it work together? Well, I expect that you are especially asking about Spring Data JPA, which is Spring's integration framework for JPA, in most cases Hibernate. And that's basically a layer on top of Hibernate. So with Spring Data JPA, you can do everything that you can do with JPA. Basically, most of the features of Spring Data JPA are provided by your JPA implementation, and that includes the criteria builder. So if you implement your own repository method and don't use derived queries, for example, then within your own repository method implementation, you can use the entity manager to get your criteria builder and then build your criteria query as you would do with plain Hibernate. So yeah, they're basically, how do they work together? Well, Spring Data JPA allows you to use all the features that are there. You just need to implement the repository method yourself. Okay, let's switch to, oh, that's the wrong browser fencer. Let me fix that real quick. I want to use this one. Yeah, that's the one that I want to share. So yeah, I found this question on Stack Overflow, and someone here is working with an inheritance hierarchy. So there are answers that link to a value table. I expect that there's an entity with the same name, and that there are subclasses, MC value, rating value, and text value. And the issue here now is that, who is it? Stuck? Stuck wants to define an entity graph that fetches an answer together with its value. And if it's an MC value, then they also want to fetch the associated selections. So this is the current try here. So they defined a repository method, seems to be Spring Data JPA. I think it was described here somewhere at the top. Yeah, they have a repository and they use the entity graph annotation to define an entity graph and the query annotation to define a query. So what they're doing is they select the answer and then they define an entity graph that joins to the value. And from there, they also want to join to the entities behind the selected association. The issue there is selected is only okay, Pamela just saw in the chat, Pamela asked to increase the font size of the browser. I hope this is better. So, what do you want to say? Yeah, the issue here is that selected is only an attribute of this MC value class. And that is an issue if we want to define an entity graph, because you are joining over an association that doesn't exist on the, you can see it up here, rating value and on the text value entities. So that is something that you can't easily express within JPA or Hibernate. In general, the entity graph just doesn't work here. So what can we do instead? So what I normally do is I split that into two queries. So right now they have one query that fetches the answer together with the value and does the, and that's a polymorphic query that fetches all of these down here together with the selected. So what I would do is I would create a query that fetches all MC value entities with an initialized selected association. Well, let me correct that. I would fetch all MC value entities that belong to the value, no, that belong to the answers that we are selecting in the query. And then I would execute a second query that selects the answers with the fetch join over the value path. So let me try to answer that one. Okay, you can define an entity graph using an attribute. You can only use an entity graph if the association attribute gets as part of the superclass, and by that also part of all subclasses. Hi Ahmed. Otherwise the entity graph always fail with the exception that you currently get. The best way to avoid your n+1 select issue is to split this into two queries. The first query fetches the, let's quickly check what that was, the MC value entities with an initial entities together with its entities using an entity graph to fetch the What was that? Was selected? Yeah. The association mapped by the selected attribute. Queries column. This, after that query, these entities are then part of your, then stored in your first level cache, in Hibernate's first level cache. And this is the interesting part here. So if these entities are part of the first level cache, then Hibernate will always get them from there. So if we fetch the MC values first with an initialized association to the selected entities, then we can execute a second query that doesn't use an entity graph and doesn't initialize the selected attribute, and only returns these MC value entities. And Hibernate then checks, okay, do I know does my first level cache contain an object for the MC value class with ID 42? And if that's the case, then Hibernate gets it from there and ignores the record in the recite set. And due to that, the association gets fully initialized. Even though that we didn't join fetch or didn't use an entity graph to initialize the selected association. Okay, the second query then only fetches the, what is it? The answer together with the value. Okay. Then fetches the answer entity and uses an entity graph to initialize an entity graph to also fetch the associated value entities. Okay, so what happens here in general? So what Stack ran into was an n+1 select issue because they fetched the answer entity most likely in the first try without joint fetching or using an entity graph to initializing the value association. So Hibernate then got all the answer entities, and for each of them it had to execute another query to get the values. And if it was an MC value, then Hibernate also triggered another query for each MC value to get the selected attribute. So that's obviously not a great approach because executing that many queries is just an expensive operation. So Stack introduced the entity graph down here, which tells Hibernate to fetch the answer together with the value with all associated value entities. And that works fine until we get to the MC value, where we also need the selected. And there we can't use this entity graph because the selected attribute is only part of the MC value. And then we need to split this up into these two queries, which is a lot better than executing n+1 queries, even though it's not the probably from Stack expected solution that only uses one query. Okay, the second query then fetches the answer entity and uses an entity graph to also fetch the associated value entities. For each value entity, Hibernate will check if the first level cache already contains an entry, an object with the primary key. If that's the case, Hibernate uses the object from the first level cache and not the one returned by the query. Because we already fetched all MC value entities with their selected attributes, with the associated selected entities, we will get. Wait a second, what do I want to say? If that's the case, I will need to use the object from first level cache and not the one returned by the query, because we already fetched all MC value entities with the associated selected entities. We now get answer entities with MC value entities with the we now get answer entities with an associated, no, with an initialized value association. If it's if the object in the and if it's an if the association contains an MC value entity, this entity object, well, it's entity, its value attribute association will also be initialized. Okay. So what do you think? Is the general idea clear? Is it? Do you understand what I'm trying to do here and how it should work, or do I need to get into any more details here? I will talk about using fetching multiple associations in a second. There's also a question from Phil, which I will discuss in more detail in a minute. Yeah, Mr. Eldenek asked if the first level cache is enabled by default. Yes, it's enabled by default. You can't deactivate it. Hibernate uses it internally to provide a lot of performance optimizations, but also to handle the entity lifecycle and everything that's connected to that. So let's quickly create here a few code snippets as well. So we have this, and we select from MC value M, add where clause as needed. Entity graph, is it value? No, selected. Selected. Yeah, Chao, you're right. The first level cache is the persistence context. Ah, hi Jens. Uh, nice to see you in chat again. Okay, and then where is it? There it is. And then we do this. Okay, so I think this would be my answer to that question. Yeah, so let me take a quick look at the chat and check that I answered all the questions. If you guys have any feedback on my answer to this bounty question, then I would love to hear it. Okay. Sure, I can provide the link. It's here. I will post it in the comment of the video as well. Yeah. So Phil asks, I had a question about the relative merits of queries written via the Hibernate Criteria API versus named queries implemented in HQL versus native query. An application where nearly all database lookups are currently implemented as criteria-based queries. I'm not sure if now that I have time I should be going through and replacing them for performance reasons. And if so, I should be using HQL or native queries. Should we replace them? Well, I would say you don't need to replace them for performance reasons. Yes, criteria queries are a little bit slower right now. But right. The reason for that is that they get transformed into JPQA, which then gets transformed to SQL. So there's just an additional layer. But that's not a huge, that doesn't have a huge performance impact. We're talking about a millisecond or two, maybe in most cases. And that might change in Hibernate 6 because then the Hibernate team introduces a semantic query model, which and the criteria query and the JPQA query both will be directly transformed into this semantic model, which then gets over multiple steps gets transformed into the SQL query. So I didn't do any tests there for Hibernate 6. It's currently in, I think, Alpha 4. So I didn't do any performance tests there, but I expect that the performance difference between these two kinds of queries will be relatively small. The thing that I don't like about the criteria API is the API itself. The idea is great, but the API sucks. It's hard to read, it's extremely noisy, and as soon as you have a little bit of complexity within your query, the criteria queries get extremely hard to read. And because of that, I would recommend to use JPQL or HQL queries if your query is static. So if you can define it at implementation time. If you need to adjust the query based on user input, if you have a huge form in your front end, for example, where the user can select different checkboxes or enter search strings in multiple fields, and based on where they put something, you need to add extra joins or whatever, then sure, criteria API is a good approach. But for everything that's, for all use cases where you already know how the query needs to look like when you write it, I would always use the JPQL query. Yeah. Okay, answered that. Could you elaborate on the case that I have more than one association? Yeah, I think I didn't answer that one yet, right? So in general, you can use entity graphs or join fetch clauses to fetch multiple associations under certain circumstances. First of all, you should model your too-many association as a set, not as a list. Otherwise, you might run into the multiple back fetch exception. The second thing you need to consider is what actually happens on the SQL level when you use an entity graph or a join fetch clause. Hibernate then adds all columns of all entities that you want to fetch into the select clause. So that one gets relatively huge. And then you join all these tables in your from clause. And if you're joining multiple tables in an SQL query, then you create a product. So if an author has written 3 books and you want to select an author with all of her books, and you select all columns from both tables, then in SQL you will get all information from the author with book 1 in the first record, all information from the author that are the same as in the first record, but still all information from that author with all information from book 2, and so on. And due to that, your overall result set gets really huge. And that can create a new performance issue. So you basically replace the performance issue that you executed lots of queries with one that the query is just incredibly complex, and the result set is just so big that it takes up a lot of resources on the database and on the network and in your Java application. So you need to be careful with join fetching multiple associations. If it's a 2-1 association, and if it's a relatively small entity, then you don't need to worry too much about it. That will probably not be a big deal. But if you're join fetching or using entity graphs on huge associations, then join fetching even one association can be too much, or 1 or 2. Let's say you have a typical online bookstore and you have reviews for each book, and you have a bestseller with 7,000 reviews. Join fetching the book together with all its reviews is a bad idea, because then you get these 7,000 reviews, and for each of these reviews you get a full record of the book. So that will for sure create a performance issue. On the other hand, if you would join fetch the author and the publisher to the book, that would probably be not a big deal, because there's one publisher for the book, and there's, how many authors might there be for a book? 1, 2, 3. So the overall product stays relatively small, and you will most likely not run into any performance issues. Yeah. So to sum it up, yes, you can use entity graphs or join fetch clauses on multiple associations, but if you do that, then please use a Java util set instead of a list to map the association attribute for too many associations, and take a good look at your query and at the data in your database and check if you're selecting too many columns, or if the product that you create in the result set just gets so big that it slows down your application. Andre asked, which distributed cache can you suggest for Hibernate? How fast would it be? Well, typical cache implementations would be ehcache, Infinispan, Hazelcast is used quite often, also as a Hibernate second level cache, or the commercial version of Infinispan, which is, I think, called IDG or something like that. So yeah, in most of my projects, I either see ehcache or Infinispan. Infinispan is the caching solution from Red Hat, which basically comes from the same company as Hibernate. So they work really well together. Yeah, and performance-wise, all of them are okay. I don't have any numbers from right now that I could share, but all of them perform really well. The more interesting question there is, Do you already use some kind of cache within your current stack? Maybe you can use the same, no need to introduce another one. Does your team have experience with any of the cache implementations and their configuration? Mr. Eldenak asks, is there any more readable alternative to criteria with same functionality? Yeah, well, there are two alternative approaches. One is query DSL. I'm not exactly sure what's the current state of the project. For quite a while, it looked like there was nobody maintaining it anymore. I'm not sure if that's still the case or not. But yeah, well, that query DSL in general is a good solution if it's still a maintained project. And then there would be Juke, J-O-O-Q by Lucas Eder, which takes a different approach. That's a Java DSL for SQL. Also provides a good option to dynamically create a query. You can find an article on my blog how to integrate it with Hibernate. It works really well as well. These would be the two alternatives. Oh, Jens just wrote that there was some progress on query DSL lately. That's great. Let's hope that it stays like that. It's an amazing framework. I loved to use it in the past, but I haven't recommended it to any customers recently. Recently means last 1 or 2 years, because it looked like that it was an abandoned project, and I can't recommend anything where I'm not sure that someone is there who updates it for new Hibernate versions, fixes bugs, and so on. But if they found a solution for that, that would be great. As I said, it's a great framework. If it's maintained, I would recommend it. Then Pratik asked how to handle distributed transaction across 2 different databases logically, specifically while executing commit statement for each database. Well, there are there are basically 2 approaches. Either you don't use 2 databases within your current application, or you use a distributed transaction. Distributed transactions is what we did in the past with huge monolithic applications. There you can use a protocol called the two-phase commit protocol, which basically splits your commit into a prepare and a commit command. The prepare gets sent to all databases. They check, okay, can we commit the current could we commit the current transaction? And they basically reply with yes or no, and based on that, then the transaction coordinator sends the commit or a rollback command to all systems. The downside there is that the database needs to ensure that after they prepared the transaction for a commit, that they will be able to commit that transaction when they get the commit command. And the only way they can achieve that is by ensuring that nothing changes. And that means that they need to lock the database until they get the commit or a timeout. And from a scalability point of view, that's just not a great thing. So that's the reason why you don't use distributed transactions for microservices environments for applications, for example. And that's why I show in my data and communication patterns for microservices other approaches, like the Saga pattern, for example, where each service just communicates with or works with one database, and then you have well, you basically introduce a logical flow on top of your applications that coordinates the Saga so that one service performs changes on its database, and then an event gets triggered, and the next service triggers the next operation. And Each of them only works with a local transaction, and you can then use tools like change data capture on Debezium, for example, to automatically trigger an event in a secure way outside of your transaction context to manage the communication between these services. It's a relatively complex process, but it's the only option to avoid dual write issues without a distributed transaction. So you either, well, if you need to work with multiple databases within your application, you can choose between these patterns that we use in microservice applications, like the Saga pattern that add a lot of complexity, a distributed transaction, which can introduce scalability issues and is relatively complex. And option 3, you just ignore it and you use 2 local transactions, but then your data consistency is at risk, and I don't recommend that. So yeah, there is no good way to work with multiple data sources within one application. If you can avoid it, you should. That would be my general recommendation. Okay, Andre asks, can you think of any efficient, fast, best way to select randomly n out of m rows, say 20 out of total 1000 from a relational database with JPA or Hibernate? Well, I've never tried that, but there should be a random function for most databases. I've no clue if that's part of the SQL standard or if it's a proprietary feature, but I'm relatively sure that I saw a function that creates a random number on multiple databases. And you should then be able to use the return value of that function in your order by clause, and then you can put your records into random order, and then you limit it your result set to the first 20. That would be my first guess, but I'm sorry, I've never tried that. Elnak asked, did you already cover Hibernate Cache 101 on blog, like how to begin using it effectively and consciously? No, I did not, but this is a huge topic in my Hibernate performance tuning online training. If you're interested in that, you can go to thoughts-on-java.org and then click on training and then join here the waiting list for the next online course, and that one will open up pretty soon. Right now, I'm enrolling constantly new groups of students to these courses, mostly because we are all sitting at home and trying to make the best out of the current situation, right? So why not spend the time learning something new? Yeah, so if you're interested in that, thoughts-on-java.org/academy, and then take a look at the Hibernate Performance Tuning online training. Okay, so let me quickly reread the answer here, and then we take a look at another question or discuss more questions here from the chat. So let's give it a try. Given the following domain, okay, yeah. Just making sure that I'm really answering the question. I'm not writing a nice answer to the wrong question. Okay, yeah. can only use an entity graph if the association attribute is part of the superclass and by that also part of our subclasses. Otherwise, the entity graph will always fail with the exception that you currently get. The best way to avoid your n+1 select issue is to split this. To split your query into two queries. The first into two queries. The first query fetches the MC value entities using an entity graph to fetch the associated association mapped by the selected attribute. After that query, these entities are then stored in Hibernate's first level cache / the persistence context. Hibernate will use them when it processes the result of the second query. The second query then fetches the answer entity and uses an entity graph to also fetch the associated value entities. For each value entity, Hibernate will instantiate the specific subclass and check if the first level cache already contains an object with an object for that class and primary key combination. If that's the case, Hibernate uses the object from the first level cache instead of the data returned by the query. I fetched all MC value entities with the associated selected entities. Now get answer entities with initialized value association. Initialized value association. And if the association contains an MC value entity, its selected association will also be initialized. Okay. Phil asked, are there any tools that let us see how many selects Hibernate is doing for a given query, how many records are being returned, etc., to see if query is good or not, or just look at database stats? Yes, you can use the Hibernate Statistics. Let me share my IDE real quick. No. I should have an example here. Yeah. Let's run this test real quick. So what you can do is you can set the Hibernate.generate statistics configuration parameter to true. Here I do that in the persistence XML. In a real application, I recommend to do that as a system property because you don't want to deploy your application with activated statistics to production. The overhead is just too big. So that would slow down the application. But if you do that, then you get a block like this at the end of each session. And here you can see how many statements got executed. So how many statements executed, how long did it take? You also see how Hibernate interacted with cache, if you used JDBC batches, how many flushes you did, and so on. And if you configure your log correctly, Hibernate. I think it's called stat. Let's give that a try. Yeah. Hibernate Stat, then you also get this line here. For each query, you can see the select statement, the time it took to execute that query, and the number of rows returned. And then you can see, well, these are the queries that you triggered yourself. There you can see what happened there. And here you can see the overall number of queries executed. If you search for Hibernate Statistics on Google, you should find an article by me that shows exactly that in more detail. Okay. Hopcroft asked if I've worked with MyBartis. No, I haven't really worked with it. I played around with it in a few of my own projects. I just gave it a try, but I never had a big productive project where I deployed an application using MyBartis in production. But that's probably because I write a lot about Hibernate. I speak at conferences about Hibernate and so on. Yeah, so if someone is looking for a Hibernate consultant, they will most likely reach out to me or at least find me for that topic, but not if they are searching for MyBartis. Yeah, and Phil just wrote that my article about Hibernate Statistics is #1 at Google, so that's great. So if you want to learn more about Hibernate statistics, put it into Google, and it's probably the first answer. That's great. Yeah, so we'll keep this answer here. I will post it shortly after this stream. I just want to add a link or two for the entity graph references and Hibernate entity graph. Yeah. Add a link there. And yeah, that's probably it. Let's post this. And let's see, maybe get the bounty for it. If you like the answer, feel free to give it an upvote. And email ask a question. I take that one as well. And then we take a look at a few questions on the blog. And then I need to end this stream in 15 to 20 minutes, probably, to be ready for another meeting at 4. So email ask, when I'm using fetch type lazy, I get an error, could not initialize proxy, no session, what I might be doing wrong. Yeah, so what you're doing wrong is you used fetch type lazy, got the entity without the without fetch. You can't hear me? Why not? Hello? Let me check real quick. Okay, seems like sound is back. Okay, that's good. Okay, good. What did I try to answer? Yeah. So Emil asks, he's using fetch type lazy, and he gets a could not initialize proxy no session error. So the issue there is you got an entity with a lazy to one association and then probably send it to the client, or maybe use it outside of your current sound is different now. Okay, right, Igor. I hope that improves in a second. I changed a few seconds settings. If not, then well, I don't really have a solution right now, so we have to live with that. I hope it's okay and doesn't sound too bad. Okay, so you selected an entity with a lazy to one association and then probably returned it to the client, or maybe do some JSON serialization in your for your REST API, and there you yourself or the or your framework code tries to access the to one association outside of the current Hibernate session, and then you Hibernate's proxy implementation that it uses to implement the lazy fetching for to one association gets called, and that one doesn't work outside of a Hibernate session. So there are two things that you could do. Well, no, there's basically one thing you can do. If you really need that association, then you need to do a joint fetch or an entity graph to initialize the association when you load your entity. Please don't use eager fetching in that case. If you Google for that issue, you will find several Stack Overflow answers that recommend to use eager fetching. That just replaces the error that you currently have with a performance problem. So please don't do that. The best solution here is to either use a joint fetch clause or an entity graph, as we did in this Stack Overflow answer, to fetch the association when you load your entity. And then the association is initialized when you send the entity object to the client. Okay. So I had a few questions here on the blog that are relatively quick to answer, I hope. Where is it? There. Yeah, this article was about DTO projections. So what you can do is you can use a JPQA query with a constructor expression, like this one here. Keyword new, then fully qualified class name, and then a bunch of attribute references that get provided as constructor parameters. This is the only way to directly instantiate a DTO object from your query, so Hibernate then doesn't fetch the entity, which from a performance point of view is much better, at least for read-only operations. So Matt here asks, how do you project to a DTO when the DTO only has public static factory methods? Well, that's not possible. You can't do that with JPA or Hibernate. Can only instantiate a DTO object using can only instantiate the object using a constructor expression. If you want to use a factory factory methods, you need to use an entity projection and then implement the DTO instantiation yourself, but I don't recommend this approach. Igor asks, how do you spread common data in microservices? Should it be stored in e.g. one microservice and in others you have only the IDs, or what is the best approach to handle this without data duplication? Yeah, you have the choice between two approaches. You can either store the data redundantly, or you store ID references, and then you need some way to look up the data. Rule of thumb there would be if a service needs the information to perform its business operations, then it should store a copy of that data. Because otherwise you have a dependency between the service that that performs the business operation and the service that stores the required data. And yeah, that just adds a lot of complexity, scalability issues, and so on. And in general, you want to avoid that. So in these cases, I would say, okay, you need to store that data redundantly. So you need an asynchronous data replication mechanism that gets the data from the service that manages it to the other service that just uses it, and does that in a scalable way without hard dependencies, and well, in a way that just makes sure that this works smoothly without introducing additional issues. In my data and communication patterns for microservices course, I show a few approaches there. You can also take a look at my blog and then and search for Debezium and change data capture. That is in general quite good approach to replicate data to a different service. Yeah. Okay, Jenny wrote, thanks Tom for the stream, it was great. Thank you. Didn't know that I can hack the N+1 with preloading. Yeah, it feels a little bit like a hack, you're right. But well, it's not really a hack because the whole implementation is based on well-defined and documented features provided by your JPA implementation. So yeah, I agree. It feels like a hack, but it not really is a hack. Srinatha asks, what is the best way to handle transactions in microservices? Ideally, we should have such a scenario. What would be the better way in case if such scenario occurs? Yeah, transaction in a microservice in microservices, you should only use a local transaction between your service and its data store. That can be a relational database or NoSQL database or whatever. I don't really care, but there should only be one local transaction for each service. That means that it's a transaction between your service and one data store, and not between your service, the database, and Kafka, or your application, your database, and a JMS broker or something. That doesn't work. Then you would need a distributed transaction, which introduces scalability issues. If you have a transaction, if on the business level you have a logical transaction that spans over multiple services, then you should use the Saga pattern, which again is something that we discuss in great detail in the data and communication patterns course, which splits this into multiple operations and adds additional mechanisms to coordinate the multiple steps of that saga. Each step uses its own local database transaction, and then you need compensating operations to take back the stuff that you did before if something goes wrong. Yeah, it adds quite a bit of complexity, and it can be quite hard to implement. Um, the alternative to that would be that you merge your services together, so that you yeah do service decomposition and decide, okay, these services, these 2 or 3 services always show up in the same saga, and we have operations that always affect all 3 of them. Maybe it would be better to merge them into one. Um, Jens says, yeah, it's definitely a hack. Yeah, as I said, it feels a little bit like a hack, but it's well documented. And we don't use any features in the wrong way. So I don't feel too dirty after that. Then Pratik asks, is there any implementation exist which can accept request JSON, which can map to its requested POJO? And respective event handler can be invoked based on POJO type. I think I don't understand the question. I would have said this is exactly what all your JSON mappers and REST frameworks do. I'm clearly missing something here. Can you ask it differently? Okay, 3:30, I take one final comment from the blog, and then I take another look at Pratik's questions, and then, I'm sorry, but then I need to end the stream. So Daniel here asks, hi, using JPA criteria, when you have a parent-child entities and you want a list of childs by parent, how can you avoid join the parent entity if you have the parent key? It's possible. Hi, Daniel. Using JPA's criteria API, you always need to join the parent child, the child with the parent, so that you can then use the ID of the parent in your where clause. You can't check the value of the foreign key column directly. Yeah, Jens suggested to take a look at Spring Data REST. Yeah, that's definitely an option. But Jens, if I'm not completely wrong, then that's basically a solution to provide a CRUD API that then uses JPA entities. So a CRUD REST API that then uses JPA entities to persist the operation directly in the database. I'm not sure if that's what Pratik is really looking for. Even though I think Spring Data REST is a good thing if you need a simple CRUD API. So it can be like based on prototype, its respected event handler should be called. Well, you would need to trigger the events yourself, but you should be able to use basically all common event framework solutions. So that would probably be a domain event in Spring, or it could be a CDI event. All of them are typed, so all of them work on the specific type of the event object. Okay. Okay, one last question. Kumar asked, is it also possible to override entity identifier strategy while overriding an attribute from the parent class as shown in the above example? Considering the above example for book class, I want to override the attribute with a different column name as well as use sequence generator specific to book class. Assume a publication class use generated value. So what should yeah, that's an article about using the attribute override annotation to change the column name column mapping for a specific attribute. But as far as I know, you can't do that for you can't use that to add a primary key or to add a sequence generator to the primary key. I don't know, Jens, do you have an idea how to change the primary key mapping annotation based with for a subclass? I think that's just not possible. It should be possible using an XML mapping because you can mix annotation and XML-based mappings, and then the XML-based mapping gets the higher priority. So you can basically use it to override the primary key mapping. I used that in a few projects, for example, to support sequence-based primary key value generations for Oracle databases or Postgres, and then use an outer increment column, so the identity strategy for MySQL database. Yeah. So Jens just also said no, that he has no idea about that, and that he tries to stay away from inheritance. And yeah, that's in general a good idea. So JPA and Hibernate provide a mapping mechanism for inheritance hierarchies, but if you can, you should avoid it. Inheritance is something that's not supported by a relational table model. This kind of association between a super and a subclass, a so-called is-a association, doesn't exist in a relational table model. So JPA and Hibernate provide a bunch of workarounds to make it work, because it's something that we use in an object-oriented programming language like Java. But it increases the gap between your table model and your domain model, and that's something that you should always try to avoid. I don't think that's possible using annotations that you can override the mapping using using XML as described here. Okay, and then need to check for the link in some. I'm sure I wrote an article in which I showed how to override the annotation-based mapping using an external XML mapping, and I will just add the link there. But yeah, that's something that I will do after this stream. Yeah. Any more questions? If not, then I would end the stream. You probably already heard the notification from my phone. I will need to jump on another call in a few minutes. So yeah, thanks for attending, and I would say we, if you like that, we can meet again next week. I will schedule another stream for next Wednesday at the same time. Dimitri just asked, do you recommend to use the Hibernate bytecode enhancer? That depends on the Hibernate version that you're using. If you're using Hibernate 5, then yes, I recommend it. If you're using one of the late 4.4 versions, then you can give it a try. It works pretty well there, but you should do some extensive testing. It has a few bugs in Hibernate 4.4. Got much better in 5.2. If you use one of the recent Hibernate versions, then I definitely recommend it. So Parmod wrote that there are voice issues again. I hope that's, well, on my end, everything looks okay. And if I activate the sound on the stream, then I can hear myself as well. I'm not sure if that's a general issue or not. I will check the recording of the stream later. If it is, then I'm sorry. I will try to figure out what's. Okay, so Jens says it's not an issue for him. Okay. Well, Pamela, then it's maybe an issue on your end. I'm not sure. As I said, I will double check, but it seems like in general the sound seems to work. Yeah. Again, thanks for attending the stream. I will be back next Wednesday with another live stream. Yeah, yeah. I will see. I will either answer more questions here from the blog and Stack Overflow if you like that format, or maybe I will invite someone to discuss on an interesting topic. I have a few guests in mind. I will invite for next week or the week after. Hopcroft asked if it's possible to get access to Hibernate performance tuning online training and the microservice training. Yes, just join the waiting list. I'm enrolling a new group of students every few days right now. So just join the waiting list and then you will get more information about the course. Okay, so thanks again. Stay healthy, and we will see each other again next week on Wednesday, if you like. Bye.